Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. If you wouldn't mind taking your seats, please. Thank you very much. Hello, welcome. My name is Niamh King. I'm the Vice President for Programs and Strategic Content here at the Council. And on behalf of the Council, thanks very much for coming out on a Friday evening. A few housekeeping points. As many of you already know, the Council is an independent, non-partisan platform. Views expressed on this platform are the views of the Speaker and not of the Council. Please silence your phone, but not your voices. You'll have a chance, if you'd like, to interact with Professor Ferguson online. The instructions are on the screen. And thank you very much to our members in attendance today. Your support is terrific and helps us bring programs like this throughout the year. We're looking forward to hearing from Niall Ferguson today, who's been a regular fixture on the Council scene for quite a while. Some of you are here for Chimerica and 5 Killer Apps and Henry Kissinger. And now today we're here for The Square and the Tower, his new book, which will be available afterwards, and he'll be signing them as well too. So just a few background words on our speaker. Niall Ferguson is the Milbank Family Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and a Senior Fellow at the Center for European Studies at Harvard University. He's an award-winning filmmaker, having won an International Emmy for his PBS series, The Ascent of Money, and the author of 15 books, including Kissinger, 1923 to 68, and The Idealist, which won the Council on Foreign Relations Arthur Ross Prize. He's also the founder and managing director of Greenmantle LLC, an advisory firm, and serves on the board of Affiliated Managers Group. I'll be back up to moderate Q&A, but now please join me in welcoming Niall Ferguson to the stage. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Niamh. It's a pleasure to be back in Chicago. I'm going to talk for 40 minutes at most and then invite you to ask me difficult questions. I want to talk about my book, needless to say. You will observe, if you can see the screens, that the subtitle was especially prescient. And I want to give myself some credit for the fact that I knew bad things were coming for the Zuck and his merry friends, in just the same way that 10 years ago, actually 12 years ago, really, I knew that bad things were coming for the investment bankers of Wall Street. And if you know my book, The Ascent of Money, then I think you'll like this book, which is The Ascent of Money Goes to Silicon Valley. 2 years ago, I encountered exactly the same mood of arrogance and complacency in Silicon Valley that I had encountered back in around about 2004 in New York City. The same sense of, we are the masters of the universe, resistance is futile. And when I encounter that particular mood, then I know that Nemesis is approaching and I get to work on a book. If you've ever been to the beautiful Italian town of Siena, then you'll get immediately why the book is called The Square and the Tower. Because if you go to Siena, you see this perfect juxtaposition of a square, the Piazza del Campo, and a tower, the Torre del Mangia, and they're right next to one another, the tower casting its long shadow over the square, perfectly representing the false dichotomy, and I want to stress that it's a false dichotomy, between networks and hierarchies. The square is the place where you go to meet your friends, chit-chat, trade, do that kind of social network thing. In Siena, they also have horse races, but that's unusual for squares. The tower is where power resides. It's part of the old Palazzo Pubblico, where the Siena Republic was governed from. So the idea that you need to start with is that there is a tension throughout human history between squares and towers, between social networks and hierarchical structures of organization. Now, I mentioned that it's a false dichotomy, and I'll come back to why in a minute. But you all get the basic idea, in the sense that you are all familiar with social networks, but are also probably involved with hierarchies too. In your work, especially if you work for a large corporation, You're somewhere in the org chart. People report to you. Perhaps you report to somebody. Perhaps you're the top of the pyramid of power. That's the hierarchical part of your lives. But when you walk out of the office building, then you enter a different world of social networks. Now, it has been observed 1 million times that we are connected today as never before. And that is true. The extent to which, over the last 10 or so years, mankind has got connected is truly stunning. And I have some evidence here in these charts to illustrate the point. Very large proportions of the population of all developed countries and increasing proportions of the population of emerging markets are now online. And not only are they on the internet, they are on social media, social networks, platforms such as Facebook, which is the most popular one, to a really remarkable extent. If you look at this Facebook map of the 2 billion plus people on Facebook, you're looking at one of the largest social networks in history, and also one of the fastest. Things happen faster on these network platforms than ever was possible before. Now, when the internet was really getting going, and as social networks began to evolve online, there was a great mood of optimism. Some of you may remember John Perry Barlow's declaration of the independence of cyberspace. Others will perhaps recall Mark Zuckerberg's commencement address at Harvard not so long ago. All people, he said, want to connect. The great arc of human history bends towards people coming together in ever greater numbers, from tribes to cities to nations, to achieve things we couldn't on our own. By the way, when you hear anybody refer to the arc of human history, you should be immediately suspicious. Because there is no arc of human history. Trust me, I'm a historian, I've looked for it. And then came, instead of the global community and the independent Republic of Libertarian Utopia, the year 2016, the annus horribilis of the liberal internet. And if you read the book, a substantial part of the later chapters is given over to the story not only of the US presidential election of 2016, but also of the Brexit referendum, which was like a dress rehearsal for that election. And I show how the men with big hair were propelled to unexpected victories, in large part because of the way in which their campaigns were able to use the technologies made available by Silicon Valley to greater effect than their opponents were. You'll perhaps notice in one of those pictures the now reviled figure of Alexander Nix, the chief executive of Cambridge Analytica. I'm happy to say that Cambridge Analytica is in my book, because already when I was writing it, which is now quite some time ago, I could tell that there was something very funny indeed going on with those characters. Now, my favorite quote of last year came from Evan Williams, one of the founders of Twitter. I thought once everybody could speak freely and exchange information and ideas, the world is automatically going to be a better place. I was wrong about that. To which I think there's really only one possible reply. Well, duh. You see, what I want to try and suggest to you in the limited time I have is that it was entirely predictable, not only on the basis of network science, but on the basis of history, that if you created a planet where everybody is connected, the result would not be some happy, clappy utopia of people selling, or rather showing cat videos to one another, but something altogether less pleasant. To understand why things went so awry, because certainly from the vantage point of Silicon Valley, Donald Trump's victory was a hideous wrong turning. The arc of history sort of broke or went through some ghastly hairpin bend. You have to look at networks and understand a little bit more about them than I used to. And most historians, when they use the word network, are extraordinarily vague and imprecise in the way they use it. But I think we can be more precise, and increasingly a new generation of historians is beginning to use social network analysis in ways that I find truly illuminating. Now, imagine that we could graph the social network in this room. In this process, each of you would become a mere node. To me, you're all just nodes. Don't take it personally, but that's how social network analysis works. And we would be interested to know in a little bit about the relationships between the nodes in this room. And we, if we could get the data from Mark Zuckerberg, could quite quickly build up a map, a graph of the social network in the room. And we would find out, if we did that, the clusters that exist, little coteries or cliques within this particular group. We would see that Neve was the hub, connected to absolutely everybody, crucial in every respect to the functioning of this network. And then there would be the network isolates, people like me and Ed, Luce, who really have no business being here, but got invited by Neve. And that kind of graph can be drawn for any group of human beings. And one can identify in the process a whole lot of fascinating things about how the network operates. There will never be a social network that looks like a lattice in which all the nodes have the same number of edges, the same number of relationships. Such social networks seem not to exist in the realm of human beings. Now, I am going to give you a crash course in network science, laced with a little bit of history, and I'm going to tell you 6 things that I learned about networks that I didn't know before I wrote this book. The first is a cliche, really, or a truism. Birds of a feather flock together. This is an extremely important point when trying to understand the properties of social networks. We tend to self-segregate into clusters of like-minded or otherwise similar people. This was something American sociologists observed when they studied social networks in high schools in the 1970s. They were trying to understand why integration in multiracial communities was proving so difficult. And they found, to their dismay, that voluntarily within multiracial schools, clusters would form that were racially similar. And this self-segregation gave rise to the idea of homophily, the tendency of people to gravitate towards people who are like them. We see this in our own time, not only in high schools, but we see it online. And this chart here is actually a graph of retweet activity on Twitter. I'll say a little bit more about that later, but you can see from the graph the general idea. There's a conservative cluster and there's a liberal cluster. Conservatives retweet conservatives and liberals retweet liberals, and there's hardly any retweeting across the ideological divide. So if you were expecting, by connecting the whole world, to create a global community, which Mark Zuckerberg thought the arc of history was leading him towards, you were naive, because that is not how social networks operate on any scale, because birds of a feather flock together. Second of 6. Now it's Friday. It's Friday evening. Fatigue could grip you at any moment. But remember, this is the key to everything. So you must stay awake. And if your telephone starts telling you to have a little look and see what email came in, or whether you got likes on Facebook, know that you are in the grip of an addiction and I am here to help. It's a small world. We say this all the time. Oh, fancy meeting you here. Oh, Ed, what are you doing here? I'm really genuinely surprised that Ed Luce is here. I had no idea that he's an item with Niamh. That's a classic small world. I didn't know that. I don't really pry into people's private lives, you know. Read Ed in the Financial Times admiringly all the time. Never ask myself the question, I wonder who he's going out with. So, it's a small world. I said it's such a small world. And I think the reason it's a small world isn't widely understood. But Stanley Milgram and others worked it out. 6 degrees of separation is one of these old lines that you're all familiar with. It actually dates back to a Hungarian short story from the 1920s. But Milgram ran a series of experiments in the 60s with chain letters that showed that there really were typically 6 degrees of separation between any two randomly selected Americans. And this is actually, these illustrations are taken from the article that he published in 1967, making this point. A small world is small because it really doesn't take that long to connect any two randomly selected people. And it's a small world because weak ties are strong. A man named Granovetter, who's at Stanford, made this point. The reason that we can so quickly get, by a matter of 6 steps from to anyone in the world, from Monica Lewinsky onwards, is that although we know a relatively small number of people really well, our family and close friends, our casual acquaintances, of whom we have many, connect us to a multitude of other such clusters of family and friends. So it's the weak ties, the loose acquaintances that connect us and ensure that we keep on saying to ourselves, what a small world. Third point. The structure of the network is if that's Mark Zuckerberg, tell him I'm busy. The structure of the network determines virality as much as the inherent properties of a virus or a meme or a cat video or anything like that. And this is a really important point because when we are trying to understand why some things go viral, we often make the mistake of thinking it's because they're really cool, they're really contagious inherently. But no, it's just as important where something enters the network. If I heard something about Chicago politics, I wouldn't really be able to transmit it very far. I might tell Niamh. If I told Niamh and she would then tell everybody here, that would make all the difference. But if I didn't tell her, if I didn't tell the super connected person, then it might simply peter out. Those who study epidemic disease know this to be true. Take the case of Ebola. It's the structure of the society that determines how rapidly a contagious disease spreads. And the same is true when things go viral online. Remember my false dichotomy. Okay, now I have to explain it. There isn't really a fundamental difference between networks and hierarchies. Strictly speaking, a hierarchy is just a kind of network. It's a special kind of network, it's depicted here, where one node has much higher centrality than all the rest. But it is just a network. It's a network, if you like, with certain edges missing. The real correct contrast is between distributed or decentralized networks and hierarchical networks. I can see a lady nodding who knows this stuff. It's really interesting. I learnt this by writing this book. And we should actually think of a spectrum of human organizations that go from the very decentralized, where there is no central node, to the very, very centralized, where there is one master node. And I think in this case, I show this in the book, of Stalin's Soviet Union, which was a network where one node, Stalin himself, had massive centrality by any measure in network science. All information had to somehow flow through Stalin. All power had to be in his hands. 3 more points. Networks never sleep. Large networks are, strictly speaking, complex systems, and they're liable to go through phase transitions. They have emergent properties that are inherently very hard to predict. So when you see a graph of a network like this fascinating graph of the structure of the world economy that my friend Ricardo Hausmann produced at Harvard, you must remember it's just a snapshot. That the structure of the world economy, like the social network in this room, is shape-shifting. And it will not look the same from one year or even one moment to the next. Penultimate point. Networks network. And it takes a network to defeat a network. Much of what we call history, much historical change, is actually the interaction of different networks. And this can be benign, but it can also be malign when one network attacks another. I tell the story of an early Russian network hack in this book. And it's one of really 60 episodes. The book is divided into 60 mercifully short chapters. It's for the attention deficit disorder era. And almost my favorite chapter is the one that describes how the Soviet intelligence agency, the KGB, hacked the most exclusive network in English intellectual life, the Apostles, which was the most rarefied intellectual club that Cambridge University had to offer. The fact that this had been a club to which John Maynard Keynes and Lytton Strachey belonged only enhanced its intellectual luster. And that was precisely why the Soviets targeted it. Arnold Deutsch, the chap to the right, was a KGB operative who recruited 3 members of the Apostles to become KGB agents. This was an amazingly successful attack on a network because these 3, who were 3 of the 5 Cambridge spies, were able to deliver to the Soviet Union high-quality intelligence for more than 2 decades, escaping detection not because they were geniuses at subterfuge, they made many mistakes that should have given them away, but because as members of the British establishment, the creme de la creme, Trinity College, my God, the elite, the Apostles, nobody could quite believe that they could be Soviet agents. It was a brilliant attack on a network. And it illustrates an important point about distributed networks, small or large. They are bad at security. I'll come back to that in a minute. 6th and final observation. Networks are profoundly inegalitarian. And this is a really, really crucial point in our time for 2 reasons. Firstly, the way that social networks form, as the physicist Laszlo Barabasi has shown, is inherently inegalitarian, because as new nodes join the social network, they want to be connected to the already well-connected. This is known as preferential attachment. Everybody who comes to Chicago wants to know Niamh. They want to get to know her because she's so well-connected. And this preferential attachment phenomenon explains why the structure of social networks is inegalitarian. A few nodes have a crazy number of edges. A few people have a crazy number of friends, and a great many people have hardly any. Second point, in our time, the networks are owned. And those who own the network platforms, like the people that you see in these pictures, have become fabulously wealthy by dint of their equity stakes in companies such as Facebook. And we have therefore added a new layer of inequality onto our already quite unequal society. This was definitely not what we were promised in the early days of the internet. We were told that the internet would usher in a brave new world in which we'd all be netizens equally empowered to speak truth to power. And only a few years ago, you would see this kind of thing which looks pathetic now. Support free expression, vote for the netizen of the year. I wonder who won. Putin, probably. Instead, a new hierarchy emerged, illustrating how quickly the decentralized can become centralized. A phase transition occurred in Silicon Valley. It was very rapid. Tim Berners-Lee's vision of the World Wide Web had been decentralized. He didn't foresee how quickly a handful of companies would establish giant network platforms that would consolidate control of the World Wide Web in a remarkably few hands. I love this cartoon because it makes fun of the corporate structures of the big tech companies. It's satirical, but I'm told actually rather close to the truth. Silicon Valley has produced some of the world's biggest companies. This came from the FT last year. The numbers have changed a bit since then, but the basic ranking's the same. Notice, the biggest companies in the world are tech companies, and the biggest companies in the world are either American tech companies or, interesting, Chinese tech companies. You will look in vain for giant European tech companies. More on that later. Welcome to the new monopoly capitalism. Peter Thiel, one of the most brilliant, if not the most brilliant tech investor of his generation, felt emboldened to write a book called 0 to 1 on this very subject just a few years ago, a book that explicitly says that monopolies are a good thing. I said, Peter, I don't know that that's such a good idea. I mean, you sure you want to say this? Moreover, Peter, if you call your book 0 to 1, everybody except in the United States will think it's a soccer score. Scott Galloway at NYU has this wonderful idea that the four horsemen, the four dominant companies, have become like the organs of the human body. Google is the head, Facebook is the heart, Amazon is the gut. I won't say what Apple is, but the idea is that your iPhone is a kind of sex symbol. Not only has this inegalitarian internet produced monopoly capitalism, it has also completely transformed the democratic process in ways that we are still grappling to understand. Everybody has their own theory about the 2016 election. During the election, I, like many writers, blew hot and cold about what would happen. But for me, one vital piece of evidence that caused me to increase the probability of a Trump victory was this: that Donald Trump dominated Hillary Clinton on social media, as you can see here in these charts. Dominated her on Twitter, dominated her even more on Facebook. Notice, too, that compared with 2008, when for the first time these technologies started to be used in politics, they mattered vastly more in 2016. When I saw these numbers, as I mentioned, I started to realize that the polls and the conventional political analysts might be misleading me as to the probability of a Trump victory. And I went from thinking that he had no chance at the beginning of 2016 to writing a column about the week before the election saying I thought he'd likely win. It's one of my better columns, that actually, because it was written just after Chicago had won the World Series. And I drew an analogy between the World Series and the presidential election, saying that the team that you thought could never possibly win had just won, and that would probably happen again. Why the indignation? Why the uproar? I think it's because the wrong candidate won in the eyes of Silicon Valley. I'm not sure we would be in this state of crisis had Hillary Clinton won as they expected her to. Remember, nearly all of these companies are populated by people who lean left. Peter Thiel was the only person in Silicon Valley who endorsed Donald Trump, and he just left town because he said this to me at the end of January, that Silicon Valley had become a one-party state. Unfortunately, he's moved to Los Angeles, which I hate to tell him is not very different. Brad Pascal, Trump's digital media director. These social platforms are all invented by very liberal people on the West and East Coasts. And we figure out how to use it to push conservative values. I don't think they thought that would ever happen. So true. You could hear the heads exploding from my office in the Stanford campus all day on November the 9th, 2016. They couldn't believe what had happened. Their technologies, their tools, Facebook advertising, had been used to elect Donald Trump. The 2016 election was a tale of networks. Trump's own network, here rather interestingly depicted on BuzzFeed as a complex of business relationships, was a part of the story. But we know now that it had been hacked by the network that I call Siberia, the Russian intelligence network, doing what the Russians do, but now doing it with technology that wasn't available in the 1930s, using the techniques that I described earlier of a network attack. We now know, and we find out more each week, that the Russians did use Facebook and Twitter to disseminate fake news and, perhaps just as importantly, extreme views. My personal favorite amongst the Russian content is on this slide here to the right. Satan, if I win, Clinton wins. Jesus, not if I can help it. Press like to help Jesus win. The stuff was being sent into people's news feeds, but not randomly. It was being sent into news feeds of people who could be identified from their Facebook user data as susceptible to the information, as susceptible to the imagery and the language. And that's the key to all of this. That because Cambridge Analytica had been able to get data on 50 million users roughly and make it available to the Trump campaign, the Trump campaign was able to target its Facebook advertising more precisely than otherwise would have been possible. But here's the kicker. It turns out that it was liberals, not conservatives, who retweeted the Russian content more. This is an interesting paper that's just been published by Kate Starbird that shows that retweets of Russian trolls' content was much more likely on the political left than on the political right. I'm still pondering the significance of that, but it's interesting and counterintuitive. Of course, it should be noted that the retweeting of Russian content is not a majority of retweet activity. And one of the crucial points that sometimes gets lost in this discussion is that although as many people saw Russian content as voted in November 2016, Russian content was just a small proportion of all the content online. The billions of posts and tweets generated by ordinary Americans on political subjects. I want to use the remaining minutes to come back to China. By the way, when The Economist says you're the world's most powerful man, you should start worrying. I'm sure they said that about Gorbachev at some point. China built its own national internet, as is well known, behind a great firewall. But what nobody expected was that behind that firewall would grow the only companies in the world that can match the US tech companies. Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent. They are the only rivals of the FANG companies, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, in the world. And their scale is remarkable. What's even more remarkable is that in some domains, the Chinese tech companies are ahead of their American counterparts. And it's surprising how few people appreciate this, even today. In particular, they lead on payments. We didn't all adopt PayPal. But the Chinese have all adopted Alipay or WeChat Pay. And as a result, as this recent McKinsey study shows, they completely dominate the e-payments world. And in dominating it, they've acquired much greater processing capacity and computing power. It's a reason why I think they have a reasonable chance of winning the artificial intelligence race, because the scale of e-commerce and e-payments in China is so much greater than its equivalent in the United States or anywhere else. In China, the square and the tower are one. They are in harmony. Or to be precise, the square is an effectively owned subsidiary of the tower. The Communist Party controls the internet. And Jack Ma is the junior partner of Xi Jinping, whose back you see here. Jack Ma said, I think last October at a Communist Party conference, quote, "The political and legal system of the future is inseparable from big data. Bad guys won't even be able to walk into the square." When you've called your book The Square and the Tower, and you read a quote like that, you do a little, oh, 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 oh. But in China, the square means something special. There's only one square that anybody's ever talking about in China, and it's Tiananmen Square. We are in a completely different state of affairs. There is a simmering conflict between Washington and Silicon Valley. It flared up briefly last year when Trump launched an anti-Facebook tweet at Zuckerberg, and Zuckerberg responded with a post. You'd think it's strange, wouldn't you? After deriving so much benefit from Facebook in 2016, why would Trump attack Zuckerberg? But I think this is calculated, and I think it's rational. Because gradually Republicans are realizing it'll never be 2016 again. Silicon Valley will never again allow its tools to be used to the advantage of the right. And one of the most striking moments for me last year was after Charlottesville, when one Silicon Valley leader after another openly declared their intention to exclude the alt-right from the internet. But who decides? Who decides what's alt-right? The answer is the tech companies with their community standards. And that, I think, is why this conflict between Washington and Silicon Valley is just beginning. And the Cambridge Analytica scandal has created the opening, an opening that I think the Trump administration will exploit, to do what Steve Bannon urged them to do last year: regulate the network platforms as utilities. Public is moving rapidly in this direction. Recent polling shows a big swing in public attitudes, and this polling predates the latest scandal. Already in February, there had been a big shift amongst Republicans and Democrats in the direction of greater regulation. And although regulation is a dirty word for Republicans, they are gradually beginning to realize that if they do nothing, if they leave the public sphere entirely dominated as it is by the big tech companies, there will likely be a heavy price to pay. Notice, 80% of news consumed in the United States today reaches the consumer via either Google or Facebook. That is a very, very great power concentrated in the hands of a very few algorithms. So let me leave you with this thought. History is all about this tension between hierarchical networks and distributed networks, between towers and squares. And in our time, it's true again. Go to the Facebook campus. It has a square-like quality. It's flat, informal. It looks, even if it isn't, decentralized. And then go to New York and compare it with the unofficial residence of the President of the United States, Trump Tower. I believe this is the key to understanding not only a great deal of history, but also to understanding what lies ahead for this country in the very near future. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Niall. Fantastic. We'd now like to go out to the audience for questions. If you could raise your arm, wait for the mic, and make sure your question's a question. Why don't we start off with the gentleman right there, please? Thank you.
Hi there. Thanks for being here. Fascinating talk. There was a piece in either this week or last week's edition of The New Yorker about, it was kind of a case study on Reddit executives and their attempt to sort of self-moderate or self-regulate the behavior on their platform. I'm curious if you read into that and if maybe their actions have been consistent with what you've observed at similar firms, the way that they attempt to moderate content on their own platforms.
Annoyingly for me, I did not read that piece. I was in something of a huff with the New Yorker after they ran a puff piece about the Southern Poverty Law Center, an organization so crooked that it staggers me that anybody still takes it seriously. And when I saw that article, I cast the New Yorker across the room and did not subsequently pick it up. But the question that you raise is of a general nature, I think, which is how do those people who control network platforms online moderate content? And I think this is a constantly moving landscape. The case I know more about is the YouTube case, where YouTube's rankings feature the restricted content option. Who decides what is restricted content on YouTube? The answer is YouTube. And a case has been brought by Dennis Prager of Prager University against YouTube. It's in the Californian courts at the moment, because a lot of content on his website was suddenly marked restricted, including, it must be said, lectures by my wife, Ayaan Hirsi Ali. This seems to me part of a trend in which the network platforms are taking an increasingly restrictive view of what is or should be restricted. Under pressure partly from the Europeans, which I didn't mention for the lack of time, but increasingly Europe is regulating US tech companies partly by taxing them more, but I think also partly by saying, you must keep hate speech off your platforms. If you let hate speech on your platforms, we shall fine you a very great deal of money. Hate speech is, of course, one of these cant terms that's now used where we used to say heresy. Anything that's deemed to be hate speech is therefore liable to be sanctioned online. And who decides that? It turned out, actually, that after Charlottesville, Google was seeking advice on this from, you guessed it, the Southern Poverty Law Center, which publishes a list of extremists, including a list of anti-Muslim extremists, on which my wife features. It does not publish a list of Muslim extremists. So we are in a very, very strange and fluctuating world, under pressure partly from Europe and partly from their own employees. There are plenty of social justice warriors who graduated from Berkeley and Stanford and now work at these companies. The companies are becoming more restrictive, and as they become more restrictive, I believe their general tendency to lean left is causing conservative content to be discriminated against. It's early days. I wouldn't expect that to be true on Reddit, which is all kinds of right-leaning chat rooms and forums. But I think the broad trend is in the direction of the restriction and limitation of content on the right. Bear in mind that there are a number of ways in which this can happen. Number one, the algorithm can be tweaked. I have heard Facebook executives boast of experiments where they caused Sean Hannity's presence on newsfeed to decline by 50%. That stuff gets discussed. And the other way in which this works is if Google tweaks its search rankings so that you simply disappear from page one. And that's like disappearing altogether.
Niall, one from the internet. How can America best defend itself from foreign state actors attacking and penetrating its networks?
Well, that's really one of the questions that's going to come up in the great regulatory investigation of Facebook and the other network platforms by the FTC. Clearly, because these companies' principal objective is to make money from advertisers, and they'll take any currency, rubles accepted, there was absolutely no check on what could be done in 2016. I think it's actually not that difficult a problem to fix. In that sense, there are relatively easy corrections that can be made to increase security, but they haven't yet been made. And we're only months away from the midterm elections. And that's why I keep going to Washington. I was there this week, I was there last week, saying, could you please get with the program? This has to be addressed, and you have to choose. You can go down the left-wing road of antitrust. You can go down the utility road that Bannon started to talk about, or you can remove the exemptions under Section 230 of the 1996 Telecommunications Act, which means that the network platforms are exempt from liability for the content that appears on the platforms. But you can't leave things as they are. In terms of the minimal regulation that I think Zuckerberg was talking about in his interviews earlier this week, there clearly needs to be identification of political content and screening out of foreign-originated political content directed at a US election. But I think in answer to this question, the most striking feature is how little there has been, how little progress there has been, how little change there has been, despite the scandalous nature of the events of 2016.
Right. Out to the audience again. Yeah, how about this woman right here, please, in the middle? Yeah, with the spots on your dress. There you go.
Hi, thanks very much. I haven't seen in detail the polling that you shared about the shift in people's attitudes towards regulation, but most of the commentary that I've seen on that has been more about people's concerns about automation and taking away jobs, and therefore wanting to see tech companies regulated. And not to contest those polls, but I think that's really interesting thinking about, regardless of people's intention, the impact on the ability to regulate tech companies because of this. And I'm curious to know about your insights into the connection between this network tech sites and the more economically focused sites. I think that's a really interesting link that you pointed to.
It's quite interesting when you disaggregate public attitudes towards technology, because there's a good deal of variation according to which issue you raise. If you talk about artificial intelligence, and particularly if you talk about self-driving cars, there's a growing anxiety about that. Predictably, most predictable event of the year. Somebody was killed by a self-driving car, tragically, but entirely predictably. That was bound to happen. It was bound to be a big story, and I think it will help fuel a backlash that is eminently rational, in the sense that millions of people who make a living by driving vehicles see their futures threatened. I would be stunned if this did not become an important issue for particularly red state America. But this is a different set of preoccupations from the ones that I'm talking about. The public has grown extremely upset and anxious about the stories emanating from Silicon Valley about the election. I think that's really what you're seeing in that shift in opinion. The revelations, particularly of Russian intervention, Those, I think, have done a good deal of damage to the reputations of the companies. Notice also, and this is the final point I'll make, I'm trying to do short answers given that time's limited, it's fascinating how some companies have suffered much more reputational damage than others. Amazon is the #1 company in terms of popularity in this country today. Jeff Bezos has understood the absolute importance of being popular with his customers. Whereas, when you ask for opinions on Twitter and Facebook, those have turned sharply negative. And I think they've turned sharply negative because people are uncomfortable, not just with the evidence of skullduggery in 2016, people are increasingly uncomfortable with the polarization I talked about. And they sense correctly that the network platforms have become engines of polarization, driving us apart. One thing I didn't point out for want of time, in that study of Twitter polarization, the researchers found that a tweet was 20% more likely to be retweeted for every moral or emotive word that it used. So if you ever wonder why it is that people on the left use the F word so much in their tweets, and I do notice this when they are having a go at me, it's that you're more likely to get traction online if you use strong language. I detect in the country at large a growing hostility to this polarization and a sense that the network platforms are a part of the problem.
Yeah, next question right there, please. Chicago Council Board Member Ann Widner.
Thanks, Neve. I just had a question on this polarization and also the existing networks. I had a Facebook argument this week with a conservative friend who said that YouTube was going against its mandate by shutting down material on guns. I guess they decided that they're not going to run any more gun videos. And I said, well, people who like guns can start their own YouTube. So the point is, though, rather, that these networks aren't just monoliths that can never change. They're going to be maybe like Fox News is a right-wing television provider, right, news provider. Wouldn't you see inevitably on the internets, different services that arise that conform to people's political perspectives, and so even more polarization? Question mark.
Well, I think that's a great question, but I'd say that it flies somewhat in the face of the way that network-based markets operate. These two-sided markets that lend themselves to the formation of network platforms have a winner-takes-all character. I had a great conversation with Eric Schmidt about this. Eric was very helpful because he read the book in manuscript. I thought I should run it past some people who really knew this stuff. And he said, "Oh, Neil, I was really surprised. You got this right." He obviously expected it to be rubbish. And he said, "Actually, you kind of seem to understand this stuff." Amazed. His observation was that he had thought in, if you like, his earlier career that the internet would all be about empowering the tails of the distribution so that the small players would have greater market access than they previously had in traditional media. He said it turns out that's wrong, that what the internet in fact allowed was the triumph of Zipf's law, Z-I-P-F. Zipf's law says that in a network market, the winner gets 90% of the market, the runner-up gets 9%, and everybody else gets 1%. And that's the story of Google, and that's the story of Amazon in e-commerce, and that's the story of Facebook and social networking, and it is the story increasingly of YouTube. Metcalfe's law says that a network is more valuable the bigger it gets. It's an old pre-internet observation. Turns out to be true. YouTube is growing and growing. It's displacing traditional television. You can try starting up conservative YouTube, and you can try starting up conservative Facebook. It will be almost impossible to get the critical mass you need to compete because winners already taken all. Now, ultimately, no monopoly is forever, but history does suggest that monopolies can be quite persistent in the absence of regulatory intervention. And that is why it's an issue if YouTube or Facebook decides to interpret their community standards to exclude not just pedophilia and terrorist content, which we already do, and I don't think many people would dissent from the need to do that, but if they start interpreting the community standards to say that the NRA shouldn't be on YouTube. I mean, at that point, an, I think, indefensible challenge to First Amendment rights arises, because they are the public sphere now. There is no public sphere larger than the public sphere of Google and its affiliates, and Facebook and its affiliates. And if you're kicked off those platforms, good luck getting an audience when 80% of news is consumed via those network platforms. I mean, to me, that's a stunning figure. 45% of Americans get news now from the Facebook news feed. Tweaking the Facebook news feed algorithm, and they've tweaked it in quite a major way in the last 6 months, has massive consequences for how news is seen by the individual citizen, each, of course, getting their own tailor-made version of the news. It also has massive implications for traditional media companies who produce much of the content that used to be near the top of your news feed. This is too much power for private companies to wield, whether they're left-wing inclined, right-wing inclined, or not political. The reality is that our public sphere has structurally completely changed. This is not the world of cable TV any more than it's the world of newspapers and the radio. It's a new world, and in this world, the monopolies that have been established will be very hard for market forces to dislodge.
Niall's most popular one now from the audience. What's your stance on decentralizing technologies like cryptocurrencies?
There are those, like my friend Balaji Srinivasan, who passionately believe that blockchain is the answer, and that through blockchain technology we can return to the decentralized distributed network that was originally the plan when the internet and the World Wide Web came into existence. I think this could be true, but at this point, the experiment with cryptocurrencies has, if anything, argued the other way. Because Bitcoin has, with remarkable speed, become dominated by a really small number of miners. The centralization of the mining of Bitcoin is one of those things that I don't think Satoshi envisaged, but it happened. And I guess that when you look at the ecosystem of cryptocurrencies in Silicon Valley being created with multiple ICOs, these initial coin offerings, again you have the sense that that in this speculative frenzy, it's the insiders who are making most of the money, and that a great deal of stuff will turn out to be worthless, and the suckers will be left with nothing. So blockchain has potential. I think it doesn't have potential to replace fiat currency. And we'll look back and say, the notion of cryptocurrency was doubly wrong, because these currencies were neither truly encrypted. Believe me, it's quite easy, in fact, to look at blockchains and decipher the transactions, which, after all, are indelibly recorded in the blockchain. But nor really currencies, because Bitcoin's not money. You would find it extremely difficult to pay for something with it. It's become a speculative object in its own right. So cryptocurrencies, I think, will prove to have been a blind alley, the wrong use case for blockchain. The real use case of blockchain will prove to be the storage of health records. It will be much more efficient to store that kind of data with a blockchain architecture, and it will eliminate a great deal of incompetent and inefficient bureaucracy that currently exists in that domain. It's a hugely important subject. It's work in progress. The experiment is ongoing. And it's a fascinating experiment because it's being run in multiple jurisdictions. The Chinese have their own blockchain experiments. In the book, I speculate that it might be in the interests of the Chinese to create a bit-yuan, a blockchain-based currency, if only to try to challenge the dominance of the US fiat system. But I asked the People's Bank of China if they were doing that, and they said, "Oh, we're just running a few experiments. We don't think it's that big a prospect."
Okay. We just have 1 minute left, so I'm just going to take one more from the audience. How do you predict humans will network in 100 years? You talked about the arc of history.
I can answer that
You,
question.
you have got 1 minute and 19 seconds to tell us what's going to happen.
They will sit in the smouldering ruins of our civilization with emoji cards that they will show one another because they will have entirely lost the ability to speak normally, much less to write.
And on that optimistic note, please join me in thanking Ferguson. The book's for sale over here, The Square and the Tower, and Neil will be signing them. Thank you. We're adjourned. Thank you, sir.
Thanks.